Hi everyone, my name is Maayan Glikser. I'm a developer, consultant, and trainer at 500 Tech, as well as the CTO. First of all, I'd like to apologize to you that you came to see this talk, because clearly you have a problem. Okay. Like Boris said, I have several open source projects. My favorite one is Mimic, which actually lets you mock requests in the browser without any configuration. You have a nice UI, and it's really easy, and it's really fun. You should try it. OK, so let's imagine you're not at ReactNext today. You're going to work, and you reach the office, and you open your task management software, whether it's just a board on your office or something like Jira. And then your eyes see something you don't like. You need to work on your legacy application. And this is how I feel like when I want to work on it, when I need to work on it. So each business has old projects written in old technologies that we don't want to work on. So today I'm going to help you to get out of this situation in the future. So why migrate? So apart from us not wanting to work on this project, we also need to take care of our business needs. We have old technologies, and employees are leaving our company. These employees are having complete knowledge of our application, of this framework that we used, but they're leaving our company, and we can't find anyone else to do it for us. So it's important for us to start migrating our applications so we can find new employees to work in the relevant technologies, and we could progress with our application, and our job will get easier over time. So I'd like to talk about a few common misconceptions. So this talk focuses on Angular, but it's general to any framework. But I'd like to point out one common misconception for Angularjs migration to Angular. So some people think it's easier to migrate from Angularjs to Angular, but it's not actually true. It's actually the same amount of work. So when we migrate our app, we still need to use the ng upgrade model, which forces us to change our current application. So we need to still introduce a build system we probably didn't have before. And afterwards, to communicate between the two applications, we still need to write bindings that will allow them to communicate with each other. So it's not actually easier. The second misconception is that you must replace entire screens in order to migrate. If we migrate, we can choose a strategy that lets us migrate in small pieces as we have components. Our current frameworks favor components, so we can just write small components and place them at the right place in the application. So we don't have to do an entire day of work just to migrate a certain feature. So there are two migrating approaches. The first one is converting our current project to a modern build system like Webpack. Now, this is usually a difficult process because we use outdated package managers like Bower, and we don't always have versions that match the current dependencies we have on NPM. So we're stuck with libraries we can't use, or we need to include them manually in our project. However, it is beneficial that we do this so we can import our specific projects, specific parts of the application easier. We can get hot reloading, and we can see all the styles of our app at once without having any side effects. The second approach is creating a new project completely and have it build like a library. So if we do that, we have the advantage that we have a clean repo with all our new code that we can use as a standalone repo when we're done. But it introduces a few issues, like local development. We need to use things like npm link to link our dependencies. And then we need to run the application in both scenarios. So we run the application, the new application. We see that everything works, but then we import our component into our legacy application, and we see some styles are changing and things are broken because we're not running in the same environment. So today I chose the second approach because it's easier to get started. I don't have to change my entire build system to get started, and I don't have to do a full QA because I changed something as critical as my build system. So many talks about migrating from Angular to something else. I consider them a bit of a lie because they're a closed demo that has a clean environment and everything is written correctly. I don't believe in such things. So today I took a real open source app written in Angular. It's running in Electron. It's actually an app that plays songs from SoundCloud. Spoiler. Okay. That's not what I have to do. Okay. So the first thing we need to get started is to create our Webpack config that will build our application. So what we did is just create an index file in a directory called React, and that's our entry point to our application. Further, we told Webpack to build it as a library called SoundNode React and use it as a UMD module, Universal Model Definitions, which means we can consume this library via a script tag or an import. It doesn't matter. Okay. So once we have our library loaded, we include it in our index.html as normally. And then we need a way to connect it to our Angular application. So in this example, I've written an Angular directive that renders React components. So what we do here is our Angular directive creates a div element, an empty div element, and knows how to pass it onwards to our React library. So when this directive loads, we call the bootstrap function and pass it the element that we received from Angular and the component name, as well as some props. We also pass some additional things, but they're not relevant right now. We'll talk about them later. Once we have our Angular directive that can render our React components, we can use it in our template. So in this example, we have a directive called React that gets a component name called heading and passes text from the controller. We have also a button that changes the text, so we can see that the Angular change detection is actually affecting our React component. So if we look at the app, which has gone missing. Okay, so if we look at the app, I'm going to refresh it. We can see our React component. And if I click the button to change the text, we can see that Angular change detection kicked in and made the component render again. So all we need to do in order to get it started is basically in our React index file, create two functions, bootstrap and destroy. The bootstrap function uses the React lazy new API to lazy load components because we only want to load the components that we use in the current route in our application. We don't want to bloat our application because users don't care we're migrating to a new framework. They want the application to load fast. And the destroy function, as good developers, we also need to clean up after ourselves. So in the React directive, after the directive is going to unmount, we call the destroy, which is just an API from React DOM that cleans up after everything we did. Okay. So now we have our application. We need to start replacing little parts in it. So what I did here is I started to replace basically the track preview component. What I did is I went to the Angular code and copied the template it had into a React component. Once I did that, I fixed the syntax to so it won't break, so it will be compatible with JSX. So everywhere I had direct Angular bindings, I transformed them to React bindings. And where I had filter functions, I just wrapped them in functions that were equivalent. For example, in the comment count, there was a filter called round. So I just wrapped the expression in math.round, and that gives me the same effect. If there are more complex filters, you can extract them to util functions, and then you can see, and then you can use them in your React components. So in this example, we still don't have a lot of things rendering, and we need to start fixing our component. Our component is rendered via the charts view from Angular. So previously, we had here a tracks directive from Angular to render each track. And instead of it, we used our directive called React. We said which component we want to load and what props it should receive. So you'll notice here that the data passing is different between Angular and React. And that important distinction you need to make when you're migrating an app. You don't want to repeat the same mistakes you did. Otherwise, you're going to get a legacy app in a newer technology, and that's not what we want to do. We always want to build to the new standards that we want to work on in the future. Okay, so to start fixing our component, we just need to map our props to the current things we need to render in our HTML. For example, in the image tag, it used to be ng-src. I just turned it into src and extracted the function it used to receive the image. So now when we refresh our page, we can see everything loads correctly. So we already have a working React component inside our Angular. But we have still a few issues where we have several buttons that don't work. And if I try to click on a link, nothing happens. Because what we need to do, we need to tell React how to interact with the Angular router. The Angular router is the one that controls the entire application because we're only replacing small bits. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a link component. Okay, so here we have a link component that we use to navigate to the current route, to the correct route in our Angular app. So this might look familiar to you because this is the exact same syntax React router link uses. So if you're writing code for migrating, you should write it the way it should end up and not the way it works right now. So in this example, the UI router uses $state, and it accepts a state and the props and a parameters object. But this isn't how React router works. It just accepts URLs. So in our link component, I've written something that's going to map our URL to how Angular understands the URLs. So I can map directly from how I'm going to end up using it to how Angular understands it. Now, you might be wondering why I have here this props $state and how I got it. So in order to integrate with Angular, I've created a higher order component called with-injector. This is actually a higher order component which is connected to Angular dependency management system. How does it do that? It's actually very simple. It's just using the React Context API and gets the injector from Angular when we bootstrap our application. After we have a reference to the injector, we can get any service defined in Angular. And in our React index, we just pass our injector when we render any component. And we can reference anything in the Angular world. So now, when I'll try to navigate to a URL, I can see it's working. I just navigated from React to Angular, and no one has to know about it. OK, so apart from each track, we also have the buttons where we can favorite a track or open some UDAO. But we need to refactor these so we can start replacing it in our real application. But we don't have enough time to refactor it completely. If we need a notification, we don't want to refactor it right on the spot. We want to leave it for a later stage. So what we're going to do is that we have new components for the buttons. For example, our favorite button. And that favorite button, again, uses the with injector high-order component. And it gets a few services from Angular, an API service, the root scope, and notification factory. And what I did, I basically copy-pasted the logic from the Angular directive in charge of setting the favorite and just used it in my React component. So now my React component works, but it still uses the Angular logic and services in order to render the app. The same goes for the playlist button, where I have to open a new Modal window. So I just need to inject the current service in charge of modals, ng-dialog, and open it with the correct controller and template. And in this case, I need to provide a scope, so I create a scope from the root scope. But I could also pass the original scope of where I'm at right now. OK, so now we have our application. We want to start transferring the data, the API responses, back to React and not do them from Angular. So we need to do a few things in order to do that. First, we need to set the auth token. So here, we have a file that gets loaded when the application starts. It loads it from the file system. And from there, we have our access token. So what we did here, we exposed in our library another property called stores, which is basically our state management. Currently, it's implemented in MobX, but it doesn't matter which state management you use. You can export it and know how to deal and listen to changes and set new things. So in this example, I'm setting the token from the token I loaded from the file system. As well, in the user controller of the application, I also set the user details, because I need to know the user ID. In our controller, we had a bunch of functions that we don't really need. So previously, we had here a bunch of spread out logic across the application, where we fetch the data, we filter it, and we do it across the entire application. So what we want to do is unify it using our new state management. So the first thing we want to do is accept the route parameters for our route and update our state management so it knows what it needs to do correctly. So in this case, we're setting the genre, which is a URL parameter, which shows what URLs, what tracks we want to see, as well as we call the fetch charts method. And the fetch charts method is a very simple method. It just uses an API to fetch the records. It knows about the access token because it's saved in our state management. And we have here all our logic that we have filtering our tracks. It's now in one place where it belongs. And we finally save the end result, the normalized data, in our track store. So we have a single track store that saves the tracks for the entire application, no matter what the route. So if we update a track, it will be updated everywhere. Finally, we need to update our Angular controller state in order to render the new results. So here I'm using a function called watch, which behind the scenes is autorun from MobX. Basically what it does is everything I read inside this function, I'm going to get it called again when the data changes. So what I'm doing here is I'm converting my data back to an array because it's saved as a map, and I'm setting it on the scope data. So there's another small change I need to do. You'll notice here that I used Angular bindings here instead of Angular expressions. This is because I've passed things like the user, which are complex objects, and Angular turns them into strings. So I refactor our React directive to use Angular bindings and read them directly so I can get the data as is. And it also helps me write my components in a way that fits Angular better. So let's just refresh it a bit so you'll believe me it works. OK? And if we use our favorite button, we can see we have notification, our state updates, and everything just works. So now we're in a position where we can start deploying our new application and leave it alone for a while. And then when we have time, when the business has time to spend on migrating the application, we can go back and do that. Our next steps is just replacing more elements of the UI. So in this example, what we had here, we had a large HTML with a player controller that actually rendered this player right here. Now, I've done the same process of taking the current templates and copying them to React components. I connected them already to MobX to have the store, and I can control the state now from everywhere in my React components as well as my Angular components. So if I decide to have a play button here, it doesn't matter because MobX controls the state of the player. So the player component is just a simple component connected to MobX, getting the data and functions on how to play songs, how to pause them, and everyone else in the application can do that as well. There's no magic here. OK, so now we kind of have a complete route. The only thing we're missing is the genre selector component. And everything in this route is already migrated to React. So now the final step is to migrate it to a real component from React to control the entire page. So the first thing we need to do is create a React component. So this is a simple React component that mimics the same things we did in our Angular controller. So you'll notice here that we read our route parameters using an API similar to React Router. This is, again, logic we implemented in order to prevent us have knowledge of the Angular application. So if we have state parameters from Angular, we convert them into something that React Router understands, so it's easier for us to move. After we have our component, all we need to do is we need to go to the Angular router and just replace our template URL and controller with our React directive and just point it at the correct component. And that's everything we need to do. Now the entire page is rendered using React. There is no more Angular in this page, except for little bits that are remaining for the favorites button and stuff like that. Okay, so now we've reached a state where our application is starting to get fully migrated. We replaced not only the charts, but also the favorites page and a single track component. So we're still using the same API to navigate, but everything is rendered via React. So the Angular router is still in control here. In addition, we had our favorite buttons and the playlist buttons, for example, where they use specific Angular APIs. So now we're feeling confident we can start refactoring them using adding some more infrastructure into our application. So in our favorite button, we deleted all that messy code we had from Angular and just replaced it with connections to our Mobix store. And as our entire data is saved now in Mobix, it's very easy for us to do. So we can get rid of all our Angular logic. The same thing goes in the playlist button. Instead of calling ng-dialog, we're calling open modal, which goes to the store, updates the open modal that needs to be open. But in the end, they're rendered via the index.html, where we render two new components called modal center and notification center, which control displaying the modals and the notifications. Okay, so everything, I have a bug apparently, but everything still works. If I'm gonna like a track and go to my likes, I can see everything showing. And now comes the final step, where we get rid of Angular completely. So nothing major changed here. What I did is I took the index.html we had and just deleted all the template code, and I moved it into the app component. And in addition, I deleted all the Angular scripts. That means that Angular isn't running in my application anymore. So our app component is a normal component. Now it uses React router to render the routes under the correct DOM node according to the correct route. And you'll notice that all my components work exactly the same because they all used the API provided by React router from the start. The only thing I needed to do is go to wherever I used the link component and just replace the import React router DOM instead of my Angular adapter. So now, when I refresh my application, I can see my application works exactly the same. I can switch between tracks, I can play them, and I don't have Angular here at all. So now we can do my favorite thing, which is delete code. Oops. Okay. So here, we just got rid of everything we don't need from Angular. So we only have our basic files that we need for Electron to load the application. Everything else is just React. So this is the step where we rename our React folder just to src or app and provide our own index.html, and that's everything we need to do. And one thing I forgot to show you is that we have a startup script that basically called the Angular Bootstrap. And instead of calling Angular Bootstrap, we're calling our library Bootstrap function. So we pass it the component, the app component, and everything renders inside React. So this entire repo is available on GitHub. You can see it starting from Angular, going to React on a step-by-step basis, and everything you need to know is there. There is no magic, and it's really simple. It's just a lot of hard work, but you can manage it on your time schedule on when you need to migrate your app. Thank you.